Hello and welcome. My name is Ambika Sahai. I'm the founder and executive director of Art Forum, that is a not for profit that promotes South Asian voice in today's world. We produce the renowned South Asian Literature and Art Festival, SALA, which in today's world we have moved to doing it virtually. Art Forum SF is grateful for to California Humanities and National Endowment of the Humanities for funding our project. In today's episode, we talk to Sanjena Sathian, the author of Gold Diggers, that was a book published in April 2021 by Penguin Press. And now she is currently working to adapt this book into a television series by Mindy Kaling's production company called Kaling International. We are all very excited about this for our South Asian representation happening. But to complement this prolific writer, we invite yet another talented writer, Chaitali Singh, author of The Pathless Sky, to moderate this conversation. Chaitali is published many publications, and as the winner of the 2021 Mary McCarthy Prize for Short Fiction, her story collection A New Race of Men from Heaven is forthcoming from Sarabande Books in January 2023. So do keep a lookout. This episode is promising to be a lively one between two award winning authors, Sanjana and Chetali. But before I hand over the space to Chetali, I'd love for you all viewers to like and subscribe on YouTube and Facebook, and do invite your friends to come and view the Virtually Sala live series. So now, without much further ado, I invite Chetali to start the program. Thank you.
Hi, thank you, Ambika. Thank you so much for inviting me here to talk about this remarkable book. And I want to thank Art Forum SF and Sala for putting this together. I'm going to start by introducing Sanjana. You heard a little bit from Ambika, but I'm going to give you a more complete bio. Sanjena Sathian is a graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop, an alumna of the Clarion Writers Workshop, and a former Paul and Daisy Soros Fellow. She has also worked as a journalist in San Francisco and in Mumbai. Her award-winning short fiction appears in Conjunctions Boulevard, Joyland, Salt Hill, and the Masters Review. She's written nonfiction for The New Yorker, The New York Times, The Washington Post, Vox, Time, Food and Wine, and more. Gold Diggers is her debut novel, and it was a Good Morning America Buzz pick, an Amazon Best of 2021 pick, a Vox Book Club pick, a New York Times Editor's Choice, named a Best Book of April by CNN, Bustle, Pop Sugar, and Entertainment Weekly. So much of our audience may know what the book is about or have read it, but just to give a brief overview, the first half of the book centers around a group of Indian American teenagers, including Neil, the narrator, who's about 15, who's 15 when the book starts, and his neighbor, best friend, and maybe he hoped soulmate, Anita. Neil is not as ambitious as his very competitive peers in his community, especially this group of girls around him, and he's seen as kind of a slacker until he discovers and gets in on a secret elixir that Anita and her mother have been brewing in their home, which is made mainly with the stolen gold that holds the ambitions and dreams of their owners. But drinkers of this potion then get a jolt of that same ambition and drive. So we'll talk more about some things that happen in the book as we go along. But first, I want to welcome Sanjana and ask if you could start with a short reading.
Yeah, thank you for that introduction, Shaitali. Thank you for being here, and thanks so much to Art Forum SF for having us. I will just read from the second chapter of the novel. This is the sort of only context you need is, as Shaitali said, the narrator is a 15-year-old teenage boy, Neil, and he's been grounded for most of the summer. and he's being dragged along to his sister's beauty pageant. Nothing would excuse me from attending the Miss Teen India pageant in July, which was held in the convention room of a Ramada Inn in Duluth. I'd not been forced into a kurta this time, but I shriveled inside to think of stepping into a lobby full of white people as a member of the Indian pageant caravan. It turned out the hotel was owned by Desis, and the only non-Indian in sight was the paunch-bellied black security guard who kept asking, "Are y'all having some kind of festival or like traditional thing?" The ways in which the pageant was traditional were more American than Indian. The owner of the MTI Georgia was a Gujarati businessman with beady, roving, salacious eyes, proprietor of a chain of liquor stores across Alpharetta and Gwinnett, who introduced the 20-some pageant competitors as they filed from the crimson-carpeted hallway to the yellow wallpapered room. "Give it up for our contestants. Beautiful inside and out, isn't it?" There were perhaps 50 chairs laid out for the audience, surrounding a long judge's table. About half were filled. A toddler in a gold and maroon lenga waddled laps around the seats. Some auntie leaned over me, her sequin dupatta falling on my face, to say hello to my father. My mother stood in the hallway with the other mothers, armed with bobby pins and safety pins and concealer. I hadn't spotted Anita or Anjali auntie when we came in. The pageant opened with a column of brown girls balancing on spiky heels as they runway walked a makeshift stage about 2 feet off the floor. Last in line, Anita, wearing a lemon lime, yellow and green number splattered with mirrors and tie-dye. Her whole belly was visible. It was a little soft, like an inviting pillow. I caught her eye for an instant and noted nerves there, in the wideness of her gaze, the way all her concentration seemed to be devoted to stilling her facial muscles. I mouthed "hi," then regretted it. Applause sounded and the contestants retreated. The MTI owner was muttering to someone next to him, but the mic had not been removed from his lapel, so we all heard him tell that very fat one to cover up a little more. It echoed, and a shushing auntie came to unclip him while we awaited the next episode. A scrawny man manifested beside my father and pressed a pile of glossy magazines into his hand. My father, ignoring, passed them to me. They were those diaspora rags, the kind piled up in the front of Indian restaurants and salons, which stay afloat through advertisements that purvey immigrant necessities and nostalgia. An article featuring a profile in the Scripps National Spelling Bee champion, "Can you spell juggernaut? Indian Americans dominate B," running next to an advertisement for Kajal, Best Ladies Fineries, and Mega Desi Wedding Expo, All Shabby Needs, Orlando, Dallas, San Jose. I flipped through and saw one of Anita's mother's catering ads, Anjali Dayal, all types Desi Khana, and a black and white picture of her that stretched her out dishonestly, making her look pleasantly plump, turning her into another safe auntie. An insert labeled "Ace College Application Season" fell out, featuring an interview with the Chinese mother who had authored the bestseller Harvard Girl. In the back, a column ran from a Hindu activist under the headline, "We must be more like the Jews." My father prodded the college insert. "Keep that aside." I did. Later, I would find it contained a workbook to help you build your college essay Mad Lib style. My name is. My dream is. When not studying, my most important experience between ages 10 and 18 was. There were the question and answer sessions during which the ladies skirmished to offer the inanest possible response to that platitudinous question and its many manifestations. What does it mean to be both Indian and American? To wit, how should this generation adjust to the new country? Prachi faltered, trying to explain why we didn't speak an Indian language at our house. My mother, speaks about 6 languages, and my father 2, but when they moved us here, they wanted us to only learn English. Better was Oma Parthasari's response to a question posed by Judge Manisha Fruitwala. "Miss Oma, which place would you most like to visit and why?" For me, to Tirupati, because God has been very calling on me recently. There were the talents, too often Bollywood-infused hip-hop or Kathak-infused tap. Prerna Mullick, 15, of Clay County, was the highlight of that year's program as she twirled a folded umbrella about like a cane to some old filmy monsoon song, which subsided into Singin' in the Rain. As the English interrupted the Hindi, Prerna snapped open the umbrella to face us. Ah, the instrument! It was patterned in the colors of the Indian flag. She rotated it in front of her, legs lifting into many rocket kicks. Then she began to do Kathak chukkers, twirling and twirling to a beat not audible within Singin' in the Rain. Finally, Prerna set down her umbrella, stumbled, covered her mouth, and ran out of the room, having dizzied herself into nausea. A few people followed her anxiously into the hallway. The judges went on making notes. The audience kept elbowing each other, eyeing the glossies, undertaking college application mad libs. And my father began to emit deep, ursine snores.
Thank you, Sanjana. I love that you read that section. And I really love this book. I was moved by it, but I also found myself laughing out loud every other page. I just thought it was really funny, and it was so refreshingly humorous. So I'm going to start with sort of a controversial statement, and people should feel free to disagree with me in the chat. But I kept feeling as I was reading that this is the first real Indian American novel. And I'm being deliberately specific and provocative about that because I think although this, of course, would be in a subset of South Asian American literature and Asian American literature, and there's overlap with other South Asian groups and other South Asian writers, there is a slightly different position that Indian Hindu immigrants inhabit as a very hyper-selected, socially engineered demographic in this country post-1965 Immigration Act and also post-9/11. So I found myself interrogating this notion that I had. I'm not a scholar. I haven't read everything by every Indian American author, but I just found myself questioning, why do I feel this way about this book rather than, say, The Namesake, just to give one example. And I think it came down to a certain boldness in what you were doing. And there were three things I noticed that I think made me feel this way about your novel. One, that you took head on the elephant in the room about Indian Americans as a social group, but I never felt like you were delivering an expected narrative about them. And the second thing is that you place this group and your characters within a continuum of American history and American capitalism. And I just really admired how you wove in the gold rush and westward expansion, settler colonialism, the tech boom. And in that way, this was so much a story about being American. And I didn't feel that this was about assimilation. These kids were already assimilated into these American cultural and societal norms, the meritocracy and the competitiveness. But that and the reality of being the children of immigrants reinforced each other. It wasn't a clash, as is often presented. And then the third thing was that this was so much about how Indian Americans are relating to each other. And there was something about that focus that felt really groundbreaking to me. And I'm so excited that this is going to be a project that Mindy Kaling's production company will take up. So I guess to turn this into a question rather than just my polemic, although I had a lot of fun creating this, is did you feel that this book was in conversation with any other works of literature? And did you hope that it's in any kind of lineage of American or world literature?
Yeah, I think you should just talk for the next hour. That was a very, very generous reading, and I really, it sounds like you just met the book on the terms that I hoped someone would read it. So thank you. I think I agree with you. I think we have sort of a similar opinion about the way Indian American literature has been sort of positioned, both by authors and also by the sort of publishing marketing machine. And I published an essay about sort of the experience of growing up and being handed Chumbulahiri and being told this is what you got, and sort of bristling at not just the sense that sort of there was one singular voice who was being allowed to stand in for all of us, but also that there was one aesthetic, there was one sort of way to be the proper good immigrant. And often that just wasn't that much fun. It didn't feel fun to write when I was writing knockoff Jhumpa Lahiri, and I wasn't very good at it. But it never struck me as like sort of joyous to read. And I think that comedy is a way of being honest. And so the books that really, and the literatures that helped me sort of come into this particular voice were very varied. There's like a lot of sort of short stories that do magical realism that were really important to me. So writers like Kelly Link and George Saunders, and even sort of short story writers like Miranda July and Laurie Moore were super important to me. On a novel level, I think Zadie Smith, I wrote my undergrad thesis on her, and I think White Teeth was like a novel that when it came out in 2000, people read it and were like, this is the first of something, like we don't know what, and people sort of called it like a multicultural novel. But it's one of the great immigrant novels. It was called hysterical realism, right, by James Wood. But I think that sort of pitch, that hysteria, is actually the experience I had of growing up and feeling other. And then the other people I think about a lot that this book I think is in conversation with is Philip Roth, who I think chronicled the experience of an entire community who were sort of like starting to assimilate, but also he wrote Jewish America from the inside. And then the Basie author I think overlap the most with, and this book does, is Hanif Qureshi and The Buddha of Suburbia, which is obviously just an incredibly raunchy coming of age story that when I read it, maybe 10 years after I first read Jhumpa Lahiri, I was like, this is an earlier book. But no one told me that you could be this rude, this crude, this political, like it's a novel about race and class. So I think we're under this pressure where we have to sort of look outside the tiny little shoebox of books that we're given to say this is the tradition you belong to, and have to like really go find it ourselves.
Yeah, I love your answer. Buddha of Suburbia changed my life. I mean, it just opened up a whole world of what was possible, I think, for a lot of writers. Well, you said in other interviews that you also write speculative fiction, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how that influenced this novel, and what is it about the speculative or magical conceit in this book that helped unlock the story, and maybe also unlock the tone and the humor in the story for you?
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot about the way Rushdie talks about magical realism, because I think he was sort of one of the Rushdie and Toni Morrison, I think, were sort of like the literary magical realists who like the mainstream accepts, and they're not the weirdos. They're capital S, capital L serious literature. And I mean, Rushdie's explanation for like why write magic was always, the condition of being immigrant or being displaced or being other is inherently absurd. So like, I'm just sort of taking it to a new extreme. And I think that's one of the things that I really love about speculative fiction and magical realism is it allows you to literalize a metaphor. And like the metaphor itself would be sort of like overdone or like the material itself would be overdone if you didn't have the magic as a foil and as a sort of like narrative engine that takes the thing forward. So in this case, I did actually try to write a realist novel multiple times about the Atlanta suburbs, and with sort of a similar, like, here's this bubble of Indian Americans, they're all competitive, something bad happens, like that kind of story I tried to write multiple times. And until I introduced a magical element, and until I think magic started to infuse my writing in general, it was just very self-serious. Like there was nothing to bump up against. I was stuck in sort of like my day-to-day reality and not using all the tools of fiction. And so I think there are a lot of ways we can like snap ourselves out of the day-to-day as writers. Magic is one of them. And it's, I think, a really good way to just break what the norm is and to be like, I have to write fiction because I dropped this thing in that is fake, that I then have to justify and follow. Yeah, did that answer that? Those
Yeah, that's so interesting. I wanted to say at the end of our program, towards the end of our program, we'll be taking some audience questions. So be thinking of your questions, and you can drop them into the comments, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. I want to start talking a little bit about the characters in this. And I thought it might be fun to do that by way of the basement scene. And I'll explain what this is. But, there's a scene where many of the characters have gotten together at a party of one of the families, and they're in the basement of this house, talking to each other, interacting with each other. And I had such a thrill of recognition. Growing up, I always had kind of a surface awareness that my own experience of being cast down to the basement of these parties as a kid was being replicated elsewhere and would be for a generation to come. But maybe, we can talk about some of the two characters, Anita and Shruti, and maybe their dynamic. But before we do that, I wanted to say that I think you captured something essential about this space, which is kind of a mirror or microcosm of the schoolyard or the school cafeteria, where there's a pecking order, and there are the cool kids, and there are the bullies and the bystanders, and it's also a space where taboo subjects are broached and boundaries are crossed. And at the very least, things are going on there that parents have no idea about. So maybe you can talk a little bit about one, if that scene was hard to write, how did it take a few goes to get it right? But talk a little bit about maybe the dynamic between Anita and Shruti and Neil in that scene.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know how you feel about scene, but I think it's the unit of storytelling, and it is the thing that is supposed to seem the easiest to read because everyone moves through rooms and encounters people and exchanges scraps of dialogue all day. So it's like the place that things are supposed to feel realist, but they're also the hardest, I think. Like, I have to write and rewrite every scene like a million times. Often I feel like the first time I go through, I've hit a couple of the beats that like maybe need to happen in this scene. So in this scene, like Neil enters the basement, that we're like in Neil's head, that's the protagonist. And then we see his love interest, then we see Shruti, who's sort of being bullied. And I know that like that triangulation is going to be important. But it takes like, I think, years of living with these characters and writing a full draft, then going back, rewriting and rewriting and rewriting to really understand like all the vectors that are sort of going on in that scene. So yeah, I think one of the sort of joys of writing fiction is when you put all your characters in one room, you have to and can know what the sort of like private and subjective experiences of each person in that room, and then you have to like watch them all bump up against each other. And that's very difficult when you're writing about teenagers, right? Who we're all limited in our sort of self-awareness, but I think I was particularly limited in my self-awareness as a teenager. And so you're sort of locked into this 15-year-old gaze and trying to relive what it felt like to be both cruel sometimes and kind other times. And that was the sort of dynamic I wanted to get into and showing these teenagers. Like, as you said, this isn't a novel about like just raw assimilationist energy. It's not like, can we land the white girlfriend or boyfriend? It's more about what happens in rooms like that where it's mostly facey and we can, help each other and also deeply injure each other. And most often, I think, injure each other.
I thought you do group scenes really well. When I have more than 3 people in a room, I start to fall apart. So I'm going to keep your book as a guide for how to write group scenes. So I was wondering, I have some more specific questions related to the book, but I thought I'd love to hear a little bit about your development as a fiction writer. Do you remember when you first knew that writing stories was something that you would keep doing?
Yeah, I mean, I was always a reader, as I think like that's where we all start. The first stories I remember writing were fan fiction for the Enid Blyton series, Mallory Towers and St. Clair's. Those boarding school books, I used to love those, and I think I wrote like an entire mini novel about the main character Daryl's little sister Felicity, who was like sent off to the boarding school late. So I got really into that, and I think just knowing that like books were always where I wanted to be just made it pretty natural to keep writing. In in college, I started doing journalism, largely because I was like trying to be practical, and journalism was a job where you got paid to write, so I thought that would work for me. And I did that for 5 years, and it was good, but not like ultimately fulfilling because I was always writing fiction on the side. And I think I don't know, journalism is a like a trade. Like you don't have the chance to sort of engage with the most mysterious parts of the people you're interacting with every day, and like that exhausted me, I think. And like that's what I love about novels is like it's all subjectivity, and there's just like not that room in like an 800 word story you have to file. So then I decided to get an MFA, and going to grad school, like is it changes things. It gives you a cohort, it gives you a community, and for me, it just gave me like time and validation. And so I wrote most of Gold Diggers while I was in grad school because I think it had just been like in me waiting to come out and drop me in a cornfield in Iowa, and there was nothing else to do, so it emerged.
That's great. So going back to the book and speaking of sort of narrative journeys and writing and research, Neil it sort of starts in the first half of the book, and the second half of the book is set in Silicon Valley and the Bay Area, right? And Neil is his studying to be a historian, and he kind of gets obsessed with a figure that he calls the Bombayan. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but I was really interested in why he was so obsessed with this figure. What was he seeking there? Can you talk a little bit about why was he so drawn to and invested in this imprint of early Indian immigrants was how I interpreted it, but I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, I grew up in Atlanta where there was like not much sense that any of us had been here for very long. Like Indians live in like extremely new construction, like cookie cutter homes, often in the suburbs. There was just like no sense of history. And so when I was growing up, history was like the motherland, ancestry. And I was interested in that, and I am interested in that. But as like fundamentally an American who was really into history, I always sort of like wished there was this like corridor of American history that would feel like it was mine. And when I moved to California, I realized that there was one, and just like no one had ever really talked about it. And I think it's under the radar for a lot of people, but especially for the Bay Area audiences. If you have not been to Berkeley and gone on Barnali Ghosh and Anirban Chatterjee's Radical South Asian History walking tour, it is a must. I went on that and I started reading more about sort of South Asian history and Asian American history in California when I was like right out of college. And I learned that there's just this incredible rich history of South Asians in the US pre-1965, in fact, like pre-1917, like ban on Asians. And it's a more working class history. It's a less like dominant caste Hindu history, and it is a history that is fairly like politically radical. It includes the formation of like anti-colonial like parties, basically like gathering in Berkeley to try to overthrow the crown. It's thrilling and on every page. And every time I read more, I just felt like, how did no one tell me about this? And I felt like my sense of self was being expanded and my sense of American history was being expanded. And so I knew that I wanted that to be that sort of feeling of engaging with history. I knew that was going to be important to Neil because Neil likes history in the book. And so I played with what sort of era of South Asian history to incorporate. And as I was doing a lot of reading, I was like, well, I'm already writing about gold. I should just see if there were Indians in the gold rush. And all of my understanding was that the first Indian immigrants were basically coming and settling. The first ones who actually decided to stay were generally late 19th century Punjabi Sikh farmers who came to California, and many came to Vancouver and sort of the West Coast in general then. So I was like, there's no likelihood. But I found in a Library of Congress archive this little story about a man that the writer of the travelogue, who's a German kind of traveler, called the Bombayan, which is why the book calls him that. This man who's like ostensibly in the gold rush, like panning and mining like everyone else. And he shows up in this German travelogue. So this German writer who is also sort of like coming out to make his fortune, like many other immigrants in the gold rush. It's like 3 pages. And it's just an offhand mention. It's told from the perspective of this white man. So the Bombayan is this kind of weird curiosity. We never hear him speak because they can't really communicate. And it's actually really dark. It's like the story of a quasi-lynch mob where they decide that this man had stolen gold and they chase him down. And in the end, they let him go. But you have no idea what happens to him after that. And so I became really obsessed with that and wanted Neil to be obsessed with that as well. I think we might have just lost Chaithali, but I guess I will just keep talking about the Bombayan gold digger and telling you all about history. Can anyone else see me? Okay, I hope you can all still see me. Okay.
So sorry, I got bounced out or something.
No worries. I was afraid that I was the one who was disappearing. That was very reality warpy. Neil gets obsessed because I got obsessed. Is the shortest version of that.
So I think I got most of that. But so was the gold rush, that thread, something you discovered as you were writing? It wasn't something that was, part of your original conception.
No, I mean, I had this sense that I was going to write something that like touched on history just because I often like books that do incorporate history, but I found the gold rush stuff just as I was already working.
Yeah, it's so amazing how, you might stumble upon the exact thing that you need for, and, just this little nugget that you found of research that I think I can't imagine the book without it.
Yeah.
I want to remind the audience, you can start posting your questions in the comment box, and we will try to get to some audience questions. I just have a few more questions for Sanjena. I think you have to tell us how you came up with the handle Neil is Indian. Neil _ Indian. Where did that come from?
It's real. It's from my one of my closest friends in high school, who was also my debate partner. His name is Rajesh, and his screen name was Rajesh _ Indian. And he let me use the screen name, which was extremely generous of him.
That's great. I'm glad he let you use it.
I also have to say we're getting good notes in the comments about the history stuff. So I also want to plug the South Asian American Digital Archive. And I agree with Divya about Bengali Harlem and the lost histories of South Asian America. by Vivek Bald, and also Coolie Woman by Gayatri Bahadur. So if people want those, if you're into history, please keep digging.
Yeah, thank you. So is there anything about the reception to the book or what people have been saying about the book that has surprised you, or the way that people are writing about the book, or is it all just a surprise? Is there anything in particular that you weren't expecting?
I mean, it's always sort of just surprising to discover that someone has actually read it. That is, there's just that shock. I think I was afraid that people wouldn't sort of get the jokes, right? Like that's one of the scary things about trying to be funny is it's just a lot easier to hear crickets, sort of proverbially speaking. But I think one of the things that has been interesting has been to see the South Asian and specifically Indian American community's response. And I think I was pretty nervous about it because I think the book is pretty critical of the values that I think are sort of like incubated and bred in our community. And even though it like, I think sometimes there is just like the thrill of recognition of, oh, that's my experience on the page. That's interesting. What has been most important to me is like feeling like people aren't just getting a thrill of recognition, but are actually really interested in the components of the critique that I think matter. And of course, like when you're writing fiction, you don't start out trying to like write a critique, because if you were going to do that, you would just write nonfiction. But your pre-existing views come through, and this book contains both a lot of love for the Indian American community and also like a sort of a bit of anger to ask why our values are sometimes what I think are warped. Like I think this sort of like worship of achievement culture is really dangerous, and the book is an exploration of that. And so a lot of navigating the response to the book has been like realizing that people are like seem to have more of an appetite for that critique than I expected. And that has been very validating. It tells me that not everyone likes that certain values get sort of elevated, and that maybe people want to do things differently now, and that's kind of cool to see.
Oh, that's so important. So I don't know if we got this comment already, but Masum Momaya has chronicled the history of early South Asian American history, which has been shown at the Smithsonian. And someone's asking if the title is Coolie Woman.
Yes. Yeah.
Great. So, that said, I don't know if you're familiar with the writings of Deepa Iyer. She's an activist, and I can't remember the name of her book, but I'll try to find it and put it in the chat. But she talks about the racial bribe. That I need to stop using my hand so much. The racial bribe that Indian immigrants sort of accept on, more post 65 on that there's a sort of agreement to be this quote unquote model minority as a sort of a way of undercutting the experience and the struggles of African Americans, even though the civil rights movement was so critical also to getting the 65 Immigration Act passed. So I think there's some interesting design of these values, and it's sort of that you're kind of come expecting to have those values embedded into the community. That said, I really love the way, and I don't want to give anything away, but I did love the resolution to the central conflict, or the central conceit of what's done with the gold elixir. I'm not going to spoil it for anybody. Everyone should go out and get this book and read it. But I just thought it was a beautiful resolution and a real act of redemption. And I thought it was really moving. I don't know if you can talk a little bit about how that came about without giving anything away. But I'll invite you to comment on it if you would like to.
Yeah. What can I say? I think, well, I could talk a little bit about, I mean, one of the things that's interesting about choosing to write something that is magical and like inventing a magical elixir and throwing it into the novel, is you have to figure out like a logic for the magic, right? Like you have to create rules to magic. This is like people who are really into like hardcore fantasy or hardcore sci-fi call this like world building or like sort of like magical systems. And I've never gotten that deep into speculative fiction world, but like you do have to have limits. And so you, in thinking about those limitations, I already had the conceit that my characters were going to be stealing and drinking gold, but I started to read more about like the sort of history of gold in both America and India. And I learned a lot about alchemy and sort of the logics of alchemy ended up like helping me think through the steps of like, they get the gold, they drink the gold does X to them, what happens after that? And you just sort of realize there's like, alchemy is actually very essential to a lot of our language, like the language of poetry is often the language of alchemy. We talk about sort of like transmutation and things are changing in alchemy, and that it is the study of a sort of like change of the soul. That's what alchemists believed they were doing. They were doing something with physical metals that would transmute their soul and basically like sublimate them and make them more divine. Mm. And one of the really interesting things to me about alchemy is that it, like all magic systems, sort of talks about there are great rewards and there are also enormous costs, and you sort of like learn the costs, and then there are always antidotes in lands of potion. So I drew on that sort of like pre-existing history and thinking about like what every step was, where things were going to go poorly and how they were going to hopefully try to resolve happily. Yeah.
I mean, I just want to express my appreciation that you really followed through and came to a satisfying resolution for me. I have a little beef with contemporary literature that's so fractured, and you have these threads that have started and they're not resolved, and I sometimes get the sense that the author just ran out of energy and got tired and stopped. But I just thought that your book is such a wonderfully complete narrative, and I mean that as a highest compliment. So if you have a question, please put them in the chat. We're gonna very soon start taking audience questions. One of my final questions for you is, are you working on something new? Do you have another novel in the works? Or are you working on stories? Are you able to write any fiction right now in the middle of your virtual book tour?
Yeah, it's hard to get back to work after you've been like talking about fiction, which is so much, it's the opposite of writing it. It's just, it feels very unreal. But I am working on new stuff. As just like a general policy, just don't talk about it because it breaks something for me. But I'm also working on the adaptation, hopefully to film or TV. We're doing TV. So yeah, that work is sort of picking up now. So that's part of what I'm working on. And then my own writing, there's essays, there's stories, there's a story coming out next week. So it's like, it's all, I have a million different projects always going at once.
And I do want to recommend too that people go to Sanjena's website and check out some of her other writings and her nonfiction. I read the piece you wrote after the massacre of at the salons in Atlanta, and I just thought it was very moving. So we're going to take one question from the audience, which is, why is your main character a boy?
I don't know. What is gender? That was the voice. That was just the voice that hit me. I initially wrote from Anita's perspective. It wasn't working. She wasn't fun. She didn't have like registers and agility. And then I just head hopped. And I don't know what it says about me that I felt more myself when I was writing as a 15-year-old boy, but I did. Sometimes we have like unlikely vessels. And I think I was just able to access a part of myself that was the right part to tell this story by choosing Neil. And it came fairly naturally. I did have some guy friends read parts of it to be like, did I get that right? Or would you have felt some different way at this high school dance?
I mean, I think it's another way of achieving some distance also that opens things up, some sort of maybe in a similar way to having a magical element or let's see. When you wrote it, did you visualize it like a movie?
No, my dad is a neurologist and often wants to, like, he's very interested in sort of like what the mind's eye sees when we read or write, but I don't really know what mine sees. I'm just in the words for a while. And then sometimes I'll have to like wheel my chair back and be like, what am I looking at? What is the reader supposed to look at? And then I hunch back over my computer and I'm just back in the words. But cinema feels quite far away when I'm actually like the narrative units are different, right? The narrative units of fiction are prose, they're sentences, they're words. And as Philip Roth said, like most of writing is just moving words and sentences around. And most of filmmaking is something else. It's not that. It's not as explicitly visual. Yeah.
Do you expect to be involved in the TV project all the way to casting or to the end, or
so
your role fall back at some point?
I'm attached as co-writer, and if the thing actually gets made, I'll be co-executive producer. So I will like be involved, but like I don't think anyone is inviting me to be in charge of casting or behind, I know what I know, which is like the narrow corner of like this world. And I'm working with people for whom film actually is like their native language, and hearing them talk about story is really cool. Like they have a skill set that I don't have that I think is extremely complementary, and I'm learning a lot from it. But all of the actual like visual language stuff, that's not like as native for me.
Yeah, that's amazing. So another question is, could you comment on, I'm going to just sort of ask these two questions. And Ambika, can you let me know how much time we have? So one is, can you comment a little bit on achievement culture? I guess, is it are you making a judgment about it? Is it a good thing? Is it mixed? However you want to comment on it. And easier question is, can we look out for a sequel to The Gold Diggers? Maybe you want to start with the easier question.
Sure. I don't think this is like the kind of book that has sequels. And I've never really been interested in writing a series, but I think people like pick up on motifs from an earlier work. I think it's interesting that some writers like sort of develop a full alter ego who recurs. So maybe I'll use Neil again at some point, but it's not going to look like this again. I don't know if I could comment on achievement culture like neatly. I wouldn't have written this book. It requires a couple of years and 300 pages, and I hope it's worth the time investment. But I think my feelings coming out of writing this book were that it is like a fact and often feels like a necessity that you have to sort of achieve your way out of your context and your system. And I don't judge that. It is an unfair and brutal like visa lottery system that demands like just an unfair amount from people who want to be here. And of course, like jumping through those hoops would lead you to cultivate certain values, like being really obsessed with making sure your kid goes to IIT. And like, I'm not anti-intellectual. I'm very glad that education has been so important in so many corners of our community. The question is that elevated above everything else? And so I think like one cool thing about being a novelist is you just get to waffle on everything all the time. You both get to say you understand where it comes from and also don't like it. And I think this book is like a dance between all of those things. Like, I don't think ambition is quote unquote bad. It is inevitable. It is necessary. In a lot of cases, taken to a logical extreme, it can do bad things.
Well, Sanjena, I really want to thank you for being with us and for talking to me, and for writing this book. Everyone, please go out and get it if you haven't already, and read it. It's an amazing book. I loved it. I want to thank Art Forum SF and the South Asian Art and Literature and Art Festival. You may not know it's quite late, especially for Sanjana, and I tried to take a nap this afternoon and didn't quite work. But thank you to Sala for hosting this. Thank you all for being with us, joining us, and for engaging with your comments and questions.
Thank you, Chitali, so much, and thank you, Sanjana. Like Chitali said, you guys are up quite late, but this has been an amazing conversation. I think we've all loved it, and I have some younger kids, teenage kids, who've been on this chat, and they've loved it too. So awesome job, and thank you from the bottom of my heart, and my entire team, Art Forum team, that have been here and put this together. So we couldn't have asked for a better conversation. Thank you so much, Sanjana.
Thanks for doing this. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Chitali.
Bye. Thank you.
And thank you, everybody, all my viewers who have come and participated. We couldn't have asked for a better conversation and loved your comments. Again, if anybody is not subscribed, please do subscribe. And thank you from everybody here at Art Forum board members, the executive team, and all the media that have helped us and for their ongoing support. If I cannot end without asking for donation. If you love this public programming, please do go to artforumsf.org/donate and support us. This is a public programming and it is a not-for-profit. So it takes everybody to make this happen. Again, a big thank you. Until next time. Bye-bye.